Good evening, everyone. If I could ask everyone to please mute themselves, and I'm going to continue to mute people as they come on. We are absolutely delighted that you are all joining us tonight, and the meeting room is filling up very, very quickly. It's my honor and privilege to introduce our very special guest this evening, Dr. Norman Swan. The reality is that Dr. Swan requires very little introduction because even prior to coronavirus, he was very well known in the broadcasting and radio and media community. But now that coronavirus is well upon us, that is even more so. Dr. Norman Swan hosts the Health Report on the ABC's Radio National, which is the world's longest running health program in the English-speaking world. And since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic here in Australia, Norman has co-hosted CoronaCast, which is a daily podcast answering listeners' questions and covering COVID research. CoronaCast has been on the top of the Apple podcast charts for several weeks with millions of downloads. He also appears on multiple television and radio networks, and he's won many awards for his work, including Australia's top prize for journalism, which is the Gold Walkley. There's a very long and incredibly impressive CV over here, which we've downloaded from the internet. But one point that I wanted to note before introducing our moderator for this evening is that Dr. Swan was the third person to be awarded the prestigious Medal of Australian Academy of Science and was given an honorary MD by the University of Sydney on its 150th anniversary. That is quite a remarkable achievement. And it is my honor now to be able to introduce our moderator for this evening, Rochelle Unreich. Rochelle is a committed member of the St Kilda Shule community. She is one of our board members. She is also a freelance journalist, and she will be fielding questions from the audience to Dr. Swan. We do have some pre-prepared questions, which Rochelle will start with. And thereafter, if you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and do so in an orderly manner, or you can message directly.
Hi, Dr. Norman Swan, and thank you. So I have to say, my background is interviewing movie stars, but people were even more thrilled when they heard that I was interviewing you, because you've really become, I think, this touchstone for all the people at the moment throughout the whole pandemic. Tell me how your life has changed in that way. You're so recognisable at the moment.
It's not the first time I've been in controversy or recognisable. For 6 years, I was the medical host of Biggest Loser. And that largely created fame for me amongst 8 and 9-year-olds, which was the core audience for Biggest Loser. So I used to get recognised by them in the terminal. But I mean, I suppose being on, one of the great advantages in being mostly on radio, it's not entirely on radio in my career, but mostly on radio, is that people only kind of recognise me if they hear my voice, and so they don't recognise me in the street. So now I get recognised. So if I go to the supermarket, I get, people don't socially distance. They come straight into my face and ask me how it's going with the coronavirus.
and they really have.
The basic answer to your question is it takes me a lot longer to shop.
And yeah, and I know we are going to launch into a lot of questions about corona, but I do want to find out a tiny bit about you first. One thing that people won't know that I found in my deep dive was that you didn't start out wanting to be a doctor or a journalist. You actually had acting aspirations.
Sorry, not everybody's muted there. Yeah, I was. I grew up in the Jewish community of Glasgow, as did one of your other congregants, Jerry Bullen, who's a cousin of mine by marriage. And I went to Habonim. And at Habonim, this is not what I tell the general media, but I can tell the Shule community this. So at Habonim in Glasgow, I was in the drama chug, and I did a lot of acting as a kid. And I fell in love with acting, and I decided I wanted to be an actor. I don't know if you've ever tried to tell a Jewish mother that her son, the doctor, is going to be her son, the actor. This does not go down well. particularly in Glasgow. Glasgow community is I won't say like any other, but it was a very enclosed community. It's quite a large community, 14,000 Jews in those days, though a lot of them have left and gone to Leeds and London, but or on Aliyah, but it was not a popular decision. So I ended up taking the safe option, which was medicine. I decided it was going to be much safer to be a second-rate doctor than a second-rate actor.
And you got the last laugh because you're constantly on our screen, so.
Yeah, what I do, I don't like to think what I do is acting, but there is a bit of performance. Well, it's true actually. It's very different. My son's quite a successful print journalist in Washington, and it's a very different skill being a broadcast journalist from being a print journalist. And his very first interview was with the President of the United States. That was his very first television interview he did, and it was a wobbly interview. And the reason it was a wobbly interview is they forgot that actually when you're a broadcast journalist, it's a performance. You've got to actually watch how you behave, how your facial expression, your body language, and so on. And in addition to the core journalism, and so it's an extra layer of skill. So acting skills come in a bit handy.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the reasons. You obviously research all your information and you disseminate that information really well. But I think it's the calm approach that you've had that has really made people stand up and listen to you.
Yeah, everybody tells me that. And then some people tell me that I've panicked them. So I'm not quite sure. I think it's all in the eye of the beholder.
Well, speaking of which, panic, in Victoria at the moment, as you know, we've had a real increase of cases lately. I know when I've been listening to CoronaCast, you've always talked about this happening. You've always said there will be clusters going forward. Is now the time to panic, or is this just part of what was expected?
I think controlled panic is probably quite good in Victoria at the moment, quite good thing to do. The fact, Dan Andrews said yesterday there was, on Monday, there was 16 or 18,000 people in various suburbs who got tested. And that's a combination of commitment to the community and being worried. And I think that's good. I think one should be healthily worried at the moment because it could take off. And people want the world to open up. They want the economies to open up and us to get out more and be de-restricted. And there was a deal to be done about that. And I said that a lot at the beginning. We could have probably eradicated the virus in Australia, but unfortunately we haven't. We haven't in New South Wales and we haven't in Victoria. But they have probably in Queensland, Western Australia, Northern Territory, the other states basically have almost certainly eradicated the virus. But as soon as they open the borders, they're exposed. And I'm talking about even internal borders. So Victoria and New South Wales never managed to eradicate the virus. And therefore, opening up is a deal. And the deal is we maintain social distance, we maintain hand hygiene, and we be super careful. And you can't, the problem is that you have to accept that there'll be clusters. And that was predictable. Sydney's had its clusters and they've got over them, but they could get them again. And Melbourne's going through, in a more severe way, what Sydney went through. And the problem with Victoria is that you've got a very significant increase in the cumulative number of cases over the last 14 days. And I think it's probably about 160 now. Don't hold me to those numbers because they've probably changed during the day because of all the testing that's gone down. So yeah, I think you need to be worried because if they lose control of this, you'll have a second wave and it will not be good news.
Mm. And you get to understand the lay of the land because a lot of questions come to you through CoronaCast. So I was wondering, what do you think people are most talking about at the moment? A while ago, they were talking about how they didn't want to be locked down. But now, are they worried about this sort of relaxing of people being too complacent, or what's the main thing that keeps coming up?
Well, it's amazing. We got about 8,000 questions a day at the beginning.
Wow.
It's a huge number of questions. Still getting them in their hundreds. And it depends where some people come from. People still want to know some of the technical stuff about coronavirus and what's happening with vaccines and so on, and we can probably get onto that during the conversation. They also, if you live in rural Victoria, for example, you're pissed off. You're pissed off because there's no virus in rural, well, they think there's no virus in rural Victoria. And why are they locked down and their economy is suffering? They get angry at Melburnians who turn up for the weekend in Daylesford and don't socially distance. And there's a lot of elderly people, I'm choosing Daylesford randomly, but you know what I'm saying. And they get angry and they're worried about the ski fields opening up. So they know, and some of it's belated, that they suddenly realize that the deal, which is opening up your economy, has its risks. And if people abuse that, then the economy will have to partially shut down again. And if you don't accept that, then potentially thousands of Victorians will die.
Yeah, and right now, I guess we're seeing all of the other things that are happening apart from people getting sick. There's also been a lot of talk about how the mental health will be, you know, impacted of the community. Do you see that as a big problem?
You mean after, you mean
just through all this, the people who've gone through worrying about isolating, then worried about their job. I think it's had a big impact on the way people feel generally.
Yeah. Everybody knows about curves now, you know, epidemic curves, and we've all been watching them over the time and bending the curve back down. And there'll be a curve of mental health problems, and that's, you know, that's predicted to start quite soon. There'll be a curve of disadvantage because people are out of work and suffering because they're out of work. The economic impact is going to be enormous. And that's the disappointment here, is that we need the country to open up and we need the economy to open up. But here we've got the virus coming back. And the political problem for the government is that there was pressure. I understand, my own belief is that there was pressure from some conservative economists at the beginning not to go into lockdown. And they resisted that, but it created a wobble at the beginning, which many people will remember. And then they got their act together and went to lockdown. And they're still talking about, why couldn't we be like Sweden? Well, Sweden is a disaster. If we had done what Sweden did and not gone to full lockdown, it was all voluntary, maybe up to 20,000 Australians would have died, and instead of a little over 100. And we would have a virus running through the place. And we probably would have had doctors and nurses dying in the Royal Melbourne or the Alfred or Monash Health. You know, that's the reality that we would have confronted.
Mm.
So the trade-off, I'm sorry, long answer to short question. The trade-off is, yes, there will be mental health problems, and there'll be a lot of suffering. And there'll be more suffering if we go into austerity mode and want to pay back debt and recover this deficit that we've got. In fact, they've got to keep on spending for about a year or so to keep stimulus going into the economy. But if they go back to ideology and say that deficit is bad and debt is bad, and go back to ideology rather than evidence, we will make it worse.
And speaking of Sweden, that was one of the things that I kept seeing on Facebook at the beginning. So many people talking about herd immunity and how Sweden was doing it well. I, as a journalist, have found it really hard to battle people who keep believing what they read in either tabloid papers or on YouTube. Have you found the same as a journalist?
Yeah, and I've had to debate them on television. So herd immunity is a phrase really should be retained for an immunized population. So the reason that we have, you know, and so we have probably at the end of the first, we got 97% herd immunity amongst children to measles, mumps, chickenpox, whooping cough, etc. And that declines. Now, the belief is that you've got to have roughly 60 or 80% coverage of a vaccine to prevent it spreading. So we reduce the community spread in the unimmunized population. Mm. Now, the most they do these seroprevalence studies to see how many people have been immunized. The tests aren't that great at the moment, but and the way they've done it has not been that great. But if you even take New York City, where there's a really bad outbreak, I think it's under 20% of the population have been infected with the COVID-19 virus. And that's nowhere near, let's say, natural immunity from natural infection rather than herd immunity. And so, even in New York, you've got a vulnerable population. Even in northern Italy, you've got a vulnerable population. And look how many people died. Look how many doctors and nurses died. I remind you that in parts of Italy, when luckily, nowhere else in the world has really run out, apart from China, in the beginning, run out of ventilators and so on. Just managed to keep it. But in Italy, at one point, the age cutoff to get on a ventilator was 40. 40. That's the situation they were in. And the trade-off for that, 20% of your population have been infected and you're still vulnerable.
You talked about a wobbly beginning that we had here in Australia. And as a journalist, I was somebody who covered both the Fashion Festival and the Grand Prix before they suddenly shut it down. How do you think we can now trust the powers that be? Have they learnt from those mistakes? Yeah, well,
I think I've earned undying enmity of the Prime Minister's office. And I'm not sure about the Victorian government either, because nobody was talking about the Grand Prix that week. It was a really weird week. The country was being told to socially distance, wash your hands, really be careful, etc., etc. Being told that thing, and then the Prime Minister was proudly saying that he was off to the footy to watch Cronulla play. 250,000 people were turning up to the Grand Prix. 14,000 people going to the basketball in Western Australia. It was completely nuts. And I was on morning radio in Victoria, and I called it out because I realized nobody was talking about it. They just said, "Oh, it's great, the Grand Prix on." And I just said, "You've got to be bloody mad." There probably was some COVID-19 in one of the teams. I don't think the drivers particularly wanted to drive. And you had 250,000 people that you didn't know where they came from, what they had. And it would have been impossible to contact trace if it had spread. And that's the problem. There wasn't that much virus around. But if you caught COVID-19 in the footy or in the Grand Prix crowd, you would not have been able to contact trace. And it would have gone underground like it did in Washington State and in northern Italy, because we weren't organized for it. And it was completely mad. And the next day they called it off. I don't take responsibility for that. Some people might blame me for it. But it was illogical. What we needed to do, the textbooks would say, by the way, not a single textbook of public health needs to be rewritten because of COVID-19. Nothing unusual has happened. It's absolutely predictable. Knew what to do, have known what to do for centuries. You've got to isolate. You've got to find out who's been in contact, and you've got to quarantine them. Luckily, we've got testing that makes it much more effective. And the rule is you go in hard, you go in early, you don't mess around, because otherwise the virus will win. And that's the price you're paying in Victoria, is that we didn't go in early enough as a nation. Now, Victoria went in hard, and it went harder in other states and stayed longer. But every day that was wasted at the beginning of the pandemic is another week at the end to try and clear it up. And so we kind of missed that boat. We've done incredibly well. There's really not much virus around. It's not Victoria's fault that they're the standout state here. It could have been any other state. Well, not any other, it could have been New South Wales, and it may still be New South Wales, because most people, arrivals from overseas, come into either Victoria or New South Wales. And so that's the situation, and we have to live with it and try and get it more under control.
So would you like to see people taking a harder line again?
I don't think people will tolerate it. And I think the economy will tolerate it. I think that what we can hope for is that they get these clusters under control. People start to socially distance. My belief is that people have got to start wearing masks indoors. We know much more about the behavior of this virus than we did at the beginning. So it's unusual to catch it outdoors. It's indoors that you catch this. It's unusual to catch it from surfaces, but you can catch it from surfaces. It's basically breathing in the same air as somebody else who's got the virus. And for casual contact or contact maybe up to 15 minutes, it's contact, within that 1.52 meters. A lot of this is arbitrary, by the way. If you sneeze and you've got COVID-19, it can go 8 meters in about 3 seconds. and hover there in an aerosol or fomites for 2 or 3 hours. So you get it lingering. So for example, the infamous choir practice in America, where they were socially distanced, people with colds were told not to come, but they were singing for about 2.5 hours, and a lot of people caught the virus. Because if you're in the same indoor area and it's not well ventilated, having a meter or so between you doesn't make much difference, because you're still breathing in the air. And that's why masks indoor, you can't do a choir practice with masks on, but that's why masks are really important, because they stop asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people, not completely, but significantly spreading it. So there should be a rule, I think, in Victoria, in metropolitan Melbourne. You want to go on a tram, you got to wear a mask. You want to go to I cannot believe you're going to open the cinemas in Melbourne and not insist on that. Who is going to go to the movies in Melbourne without a mask on? Now, the masks don't protect you, most masks. They generally protect people carrying the virus from giving it to other people. So, I think masks are going to have to be used in Victoria, and they might over a month get us over the hump and get things a bit better under control, particularly if they're still seeing clusters popping up.
Well, if anyone will get the masks aspect over the line, it's you, because when you last spoke about masks, very soon afterwards, Brendan Murphy was recommending masks on public transport as well. So do you often feel the weight of that you talk and people really listen in?
I think Brendan, who I know very well, would deny vehemently anything he says as a result of me, and I would deny it too. I don't think that that's the case. What I will say, though, is that it's been quite easy to be ahead of the pack in this story, because if you know basic epidemiology and public health, and you watch what was happening in China, you could actually predict what was happening a few days before it did. And therefore you could actually say this is going to happen or this should happen and what have you. And that's what annoyed the government, is that the ABC's managing director got phone calls from the Prime Minister, well, from the government, and actually it was the head of news as well, and and asked them, was I making mistakes? Is there something that I needed to correct? No. It was just that I was ahead of them, and that's what really annoyed them.
We're getting quite a few questions through about vaccines. People wanting to know if they really, if that's how long away that might be, and if that's if they have to sort of be on high alert until then.
The answer is yes, you are going to be on high alert. We're not going to be doing much overseas travel or allowing overseas people in until we've got a vaccine. We can't dispense with hotel or quarantine, or we might be able to change quarantine a bit, because it's not been very successful in Victoria, unfortunately, because you've had that spread from the Regis Hotel. So yes, vaccine is the way we get out of this. It is not easy to produce a vaccine for a respiratory illness such as this, although we do have vaccines. Measles is a respiratory illness, and we've got effective vaccine against measles, but it infects in a slightly different way. There are animal vaccines for coronavirus, different coronavirus, which are respiratory illnesses. They're not 100% effective. So here's possibly the story with vaccines. It's hard to know exactly how many vaccines are under development, probably more than 100, the number varies. Overall, when you look at the history of vaccines, the success in vaccine development is about 5 to 10%. So if there's 100 in development, if you bet on the Melbourne Cup, you would bet that there's going to be maybe 5 or 7 vaccines coming out of the current crop. The vaccines that come out may well not be 100% effective, but we're used to that. The influenza vaccine is not a good vaccine. It's a dead form of the influenza viruses that's in it, doesn't create a terrific immune response, and doesn't give you 100% coverage, even with the types of influenza that are in the vaccine. And then it doesn't cover all influenzas as well. So it's not a great vaccine, and it may well be. So the easiest vaccine for them to produce will actually be one that contains a lot of the virus, along with a chemical that stimulates the immune system. And that could well be the one that, you know, something like that that works, where you've got a chunk of the virus in some shape or form. So the problem with SARS, the original SARS in 2003, was that the vaccines they developed then, some of them, I'm not sure how many, maybe it was just one, when they immunized monkeys, and they got a great antibody response, but when they exposed them to SARS virus, they got an overreaction to the immune system, pretty much like COVID-19. That's the problem. And so they're worried about this enhanced antibody response or cytokine storm that you might get with the vaccine. It looks as though the good news seems to be that the safety studies they've done so far on the vaccines that are in trial are not showing this. They're not showing, at least with the vaccine itself, showing an enhanced antibody response. But people have yet to be exposed to the virus. So that's the phase 2, the next phase of trials. So the safety is a real worry. And but there are hopeful vaccines. The one that's being produced out of Oxford University looks good. The one that's being produced, the University of Queensland one might be okay, and they're working, I think, with CSL in Victoria on this adjuvant, the chemical that goes with it. There's also a phase 1 trial going on in Australia with the Nucleus Group out of University of Melbourne and Queensland, of an American vaccine where the secret sauce is indeed this chemical that stimulates the immune system. So there's a lot going on, and the Oxford vaccine is being manufactured as we speak in the hope that it works. But Peter Doherty on the Radio National this morning was saying that he didn't think that the Australian public could expect a vaccine realistically before, for another year.
Mm. I'll let everyone know that they can only ask questions by using the chat format. Is that correct? Yes. I've got a question from Jane. She wanted to know, if you're working in a hotspot area in Melbourne, are you putting yourself at risk by going to work?
I think that, so at the moment it's clusters. It's hard to know how much circulating virus there is out there. They're taking, I'm circulating around the story because the answer is you don't know. That's, the short answer is you don't know. Here's the long answer. So they're taking a traditional public health approach when you don't have a pervasive epidemic going on, is that when it pops up, you ring fence the cluster that pops up. This is how they controlled smallpox, and you decide, I'm going to take a 5-kilometer radius around that cluster, or a 10-kilometer radius, and I'm going to go in, and that's what they're doing. They're door knocking and they're testing, and they're trying to grab how much is in this community. But just because you live in Coburg doesn't mean that that's where the virus is, because you catch the tram into town. And in the olden days, you stayed roughly where you lived, or the city was smaller. But now you could be across town. You could be working in Templestowe or Dandenong, and you live in Coburg. So the virus could be much more widely spread. I think that workplaces in the hotspot areas should insist on masks in the staff to protect each other. I think if you're at risk yourself, there'll be some questions here from people who are a bit older, who are worried about this. And if you're worried, then you should get one of those N95 masks. I wouldn't have said this 2 or 3 months ago, because hospitals and dentists and others there weren't enough masks for them, but we're okay, I think, at the moment. So you get one, but not one with a valve at the front, because those masks are designed for dust and particulates. And so all they're worried about is filtering on the way in, not necessarily on the way out. And those masks can spread infection. But the other N95 masks that don't have those one-way valves are okay, but they've got to be sealed to make a difference. And how you test that is you might spray some perfume nearby, and if you can smell the perfume, it's not a perfect seal. So you might as well just wear a cloth mask or a surgical mask. It's not good at protecting you, but it's pretty good at stopping the virus going to other people through droplets.
Thanks. Another question is, why are there discrepancies with testing results?
Because the test isn't a perfect test. There's lots of things that can go wrong. You might sort of pull away because you don't like this thing going up your nose. The person doing the test might not get, You've got to circle around a little bit to get enough tissue on it to really do a proper sample. And there are, and when they grow it up, when they grow up the genetic material, if you're early or late in the stage of infection, there may just not be enough there to trigger the test. And so the evidence from overseas is, so this is normally we would know a lot about the performance of a test before you introduce it. But because we did it in a hurry, it's not that they're bad tests, it's just that every test is inaccurate in some shape or form. And it's important that pathologists know how inaccurate they are. And so if you, let's imagine you've been infected yesterday. If you got a test today, there's almost 100% chance that it's negative because you just haven't got enough virus. And then it comes down, and the most accurate is probably about 8 days after infection, and then it becomes more and more inaccurate again. So there is a negativity there. So for example, if you're feeling a bit unwell and fatigued, you've got a cough and a cold, and or you might, the only symptom you've got is you can't smell things as well, or you can't taste things as well. If you've lost your sense of taste or smell at the moment, you have got COVID-19 until proven otherwise, regardless of what the test shows. Sore throat is a bit rare. If you've got a sore throat, it probably isn't, but you can't guarantee that. Everybody with a symptom needs to get tested. And if the symptoms persist or you get sicker, you've got to have another test because you can't be sure that that first test was wrong. False positives, that means, so that's, you've got the infection, but the test doesn't show up positive. It doesn't show up positive. Then false positives is it shows up positive, but you haven't got the infection. So that footballer in Essendon is now claiming, here they're claiming that he's now negative. So false positives are unusual, and nobody's quite sure why you get false positives. It's probably that there are still, common cold viruses out there, which are coronaviruses, and it may well be that they cross-react with the COVID-19 test, and you show up positive when you're not. Or there's contamination. There's all sorts of things that can happen. So when there's doubt, you do more than one test.
I've got a question from Charlotte, who says she's at high risk for COVID-19 and she's got a scarred lung. She lives with her husband, who's a community pharmacist in a questionable area. And she asks, are we playing Russian roulette by living together, and should we live apart until COVID-19 is better contained?
Well, there's no doubt that healthcare workers are at higher risk. So you can help to protect yourself in the pharmacy by wearing an N95 mask and hand hygiene all the time and making sure all the surface is there. And it's unlikely that you would catch it. I mean, if you're look, I'm not going to give solid advice to an individual, but you would reduce your risk dramatically to you yourself by wearing that mask. It's up to you to insist that if people were coming into the store, that they come into the store and wear a mask. And that would reduce the risk quite a lot as well. But you're not as high risk as a nurse or a doctor in an emergency department. And the other thing is passing it on to others. So you had that situation with the GP in Melbourne, who's passed it on to 11 or 12, I can't remember the number now, I think yesterday it was 11 or 12 people. So the GP was infected. I'm not sure they knew that they were infected. I don't know the full story, but healthcare professionals should be wearing masks, not just to protect themselves, but to protect their patients too.
When somebody's a super spreader like that, it's not about their how contagious they are. It's about the opportunity that they have to spread it. Is that right?
It's both. So it's both. So some people do seem to be super spreaders in the same situation when you look at the cruise ships and so on. But you're right. If you catch the COVID-19 virus and you're not very social and you don't have a big social network and you're at home and you don't mix with other people, you're not going to spread it to anybody. It'll just disappear from you and nobody else will catch it. But if you're social and you go out, and here's the classic situation, and the Premier's right, is the place that you catch this is with your family. That was true in China, and it's been true since, that you catch it. So the kids that are turning up in school, they're not catching it at school. they're catching it at home at a birthday party or a family affair. And so that's where you catch it, is at home, because you don't socially distance very well. And even if you were to socially distance at home and not hug and kiss, if you're in the lounge room and it's somebody's birthday and you're all singing happy birthday and you're laughing and shouting and having animated conversation, you can catch COVID-19 from somebody in the corner, because eventually the virus circulates in the room. And some people say you only have to be in the room with somebody with COVID-19 for 30 minutes, irrespective of social distancing, for you to breathe it in. Now, you can make it worse by the hugging. So hence the numbers. If you reduce the numbers, it's just the odds thing. If you fewer people means fewer chances to pick up the virus.
So I've got a question that's probably pertinent to some people here who say, do grandparents need to stay away from their grandchildren?
So I have a bit of a problem with this, because I hear lots of people saying you're being patronizing towards their elderly parents or elderly grandparents, and saying, oh, we've got to look after them and we're not going to do this and we're going to do this garden. I actually think that you don't turn into this helpless child just because you're over 70, and you can make decisions for yourself. But if age is the biggest risk factor. Children don't spread the virus that much. The group that if you've got older grandchildren who are maybe 18 to 30, that's a group that spreads it. But younger children don't, by and large. So if you are feeling vulnerable and you're older and you're worried, then maintain a social distance and don't have people around to your house. If you want to compromise on that, you could wear an N95 mask, and you could have the kids around to the house, and just be careful with your hand hygiene and so on. But you're not going to catch, in the current situation, you're not going to catch from a little baby. You're not going to catch it from a young child. Adolescents, older grandchildren, what have you, I think you've got to be very careful. And then people could wear masks when they come into the house. And it feels odd, but at the moment, I'd just be a bit careful. I actually haven't quite looked whether there'll be many cases in Caulfield or the traditional, within the Erev, if you like. So I'm not quite sure, but Jewish community is vulnerable because very family oriented. I had an interesting situation where for the Board of Deputies, I did a video for Pesach. The Islamic Council of Victoria saw this and they asked me to do a video for the Islamic community in Victoria for Ramadan. And it's the same, it's the same story. I was absolutely delighted to do it, and I've gone very well with the Sheikh, and I gave almost the identical video message to the Islamic community as to the Jewish community. And it's about family, and it's, in their case, it was in the mosque. In our case, it's a shul. And mosques and shuls and churches are places which are recognized to be spreading areas, because we're singing, we're talking, and we're cheek by jowl, and we're there for a while. And but it's the family as well.
So speaking of that, what did you end up doing for Pesach?
A virtual Seder. It was very boring because I don't make as nice kneidlich as my cousin does, where I normally go. And she wasn't into posting the kneidlich to me.
So apart from wearing masks,
one of the good things about lockdown has been that I've actually resurrected my grandmother's recipe for kneidlich, and my kneidlich making has improved immensely.
Very good. You and a few people, I think, have gone to their kitchens. I'm surprised you have the time, because I would think that you'd be, I don't know how you're keeping up with the level of news that you are and research.
I don't have a lot of time, but I've still got some.
Is there anything that you think people should do as a preventative, like take vitamin D, zinc, all the kind of remedies we're reading about now?
If only there were a way of doing it. The zinc is okay. Maybe zinc, when you've got the common cold, can speed up recovery. It's controversial, but there's a bit of evidence for that. But it's not known as a preventive. There's really no, I wish it was. I mean, I just think that it's important that you get out into the sun, you get exercise, you keep your body as fit as it possibly can be. If you've got a chronic illness, you want to get it under control. If you've got asthma, you really do want to work with your GP to get your asthma under control. Chronic obstructive lung disease, heart failure, and those sorts of things. You want to be as fit and as well as you can possibly be. That's the best preventive. And unfortunately, you can't turn back your age and then your behavior. I mean, this virus in the natural environment will spread from individuals to 2 or 3 other people. In New York, by the way, it was probably 6 other people because of the population density. And our behavior can change this virus down to, you know, that magical figure of 1 or less than 1, that you're not passing it to any more than 1 other person or fewer than that. That's what we've got to do. That's the best preventive.
Somebody's asked about the protest marches. Were you surprised that there wasn't a greater spread of disease after the marches?
Not really. You probably had more than 60% of people wearing masks, and that's the number that you probably need to stop spread. There hasn't been any spread from marches. You know, New South Wales, nothing. Here, there's been a few people who have been cases in other clusters, but they're not convincingly, and were at the march wearing masks, and they were unlikely or didn't. I made a mistake yesterday, actually, in my coronacast. I thought that the guy who had spread in H&M, in fact, that was the original report, had actually been infected at the march, and he hadn't been. Then that's one of the risks away from what I do, is I'm moving all the time. And in that case, I didn't notice that I hadn't updated my information. The information changes all the time. So they've been okay. I mean, I heard Bill Shorten on Patricia Carvelis on Radio National this evening saying that he was opposed to the protests for the same reason a lot of other people have been, which is that it says, well, if 10,000 people can mix, why can't I go to the foodie, and why can't I just go and hug my grandparents and so on? But the masks were the key there that really made a difference. We could have a lot of people turning up to the MCG if they were wearing masks. We could go back to even in Victoria in the current situation, we could continue opening up if you insisted on masks in situations where you cannot socially distance. It could make a big difference. But the National Health Committee is against masks. World Health Organization is pro-masks, and the evidence is quite strong. As long as the masks are well designed, triple layer, waterproof on the outside, densely woven cotton on the inside, then maybe cotton again on the middle layer. You can make it for yourself. You can buy some, or even a surgical mask if you can get it, but fully covering the face. It doesn't have to be an N95.
Well, I know that we're out of time with you because you are on a deadline to do your work and your obligations. So we did have more questions, but we'll have to leave it there. Unless you wanted to add anything, I wanted to really thank you for your time.
No, it's a pleasure.
It's been great having you, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks. Thanks, Rochelle.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.